The U.S. will not take Greenland by force. That was the message from President Trump to the World Economic Forum today in Davos, Switzerland, in a much anticipated speech. Here to discuss, Niall Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill. Hey, Niall, so let's take a listen to the president's message to NATO on the question of Greenland.
We never asked for anything, and we never got anything. We probably won't get anything unless I decide to use excessive strength and force where we would be, frankly, unstoppable. But I won't do that. Okay? Now everyone's saying, oh, good.
So probably won't get anything unless we use force, but I won't do that. So how do you, Niall, think that will be interpreted by the international community?
Well, I do think there will be some relief, Drew, on the point about use of force. The president had previously declined to rule out using force to take Greenland. Obviously, this is a shift in position there. Now, something that we may go on to talk about here is he's not giving up at all the ambition for American control of Greenland. In fact, he's very emphatic that he still wants that. But yes, of course, taking the idea of some sort of US military invasion or occupation of Greenland off the table, I think that's welcomed by the international community writ large in pretty emphatic terms.
At another point, Trump said regarding Greenland, you can say yes and we'll be very appreciative, or you can say no and we'll remember. That seems to be a pretty ominous warning to U.S. allies.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And of course, it comes hand in hand with these tariffs that he has promised to levy on several nations in Europe, including nations that have traditionally been very strong US allies, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, I believe, is on that list as well. So there is obviously still a willingness on Trump's part to use other forms of pressure, even if those other forms of pressure stop short of military coercion.
Trump portrayed NATO allies as ungrateful. He actually name-checked Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, French President Emmanuel Macron, two leaders that used their speeches at Davos to urge NATO allies to stand up to Trump. How do you think Trump's speech impacts the appetite for NATO allies to take a more forceful posture toward the U.S.?
It's a great question, Drew, and I think this is really maybe the biggest overarching issue here. Whether it's Mark Carney or Emmanuel Macron or other European leaders like Macron, there is obviously a real schism here, a real sort of fundamental realigning of the shape of the world as it has been approximately since the end of the Second World War. And so you're seeing Canada and the European nations really trying to figure out a way to bind themselves together without the US or without being so dependent on the US. Basically, these traditional American allies no longer see the United States as reliable in the way that they once had, and now that President Trump is in charge.
I kind of feel like we've seen this movie before to a certain extent. President Trump does or says things that rattle NATO allies. Then they all get together and kind of make nice. Then Trump leaves singing the praise of European leaders and things cool down sort of until the next flare-up. Is there any reason to believe that that's not going to be the case again here?
There are some reasons to believe that it might be different this time, I think. One is the propensity of Trump to now put almost everything in the framework of his so-called Don Roe doctrine, which, to make a long story short, is about American dominance of the Western Hemisphere. He was even talking about Greenland in those terms at his speech in Davos. I think that is different to the kind of worldview that has typically sustained the NATO and the sort of US Western Europe alliance more generally.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on, kind of this notion that we heard from people like Macron or even Mark Carney on the possibility of breaking up the transatlantic alliance, upending the rules-based international order? How far, in your opinion, are we actually down that path?
The Europeans and the Canadians are taking the first steps down that path. It's a very long path, though. That would be, I guess, how I would see it. In terms of, for example, is Europe talking about having a defense policy that completely ignores the United States. If they are talking about that, then it would take a significant period of time to literally build up military strength of that nature. Also, it seems to me, just as a point of fact, you can't ignore the United States. You're either aligned with it or at some level antagonistic to it. How is that supposed to be managed? So I think we're seeing tensions and schisms that we haven't seen, frankly, in my lifetime between Western Europe and the United States and Canada. But how that ultimately plays out is yet to be decided.
One more question before I let you go. What do you make of the ability of Europe and other NATO allies, Canada included, to kind of stay together and coalesce around a strategy when it comes to dealing with President Trump?
They do have an interest in doing so because I think their belief that Trump's volatility makes it very difficult to deal with the US right now, that seems almost a universal belief among the nations that we're talking about. It's simply that all of these leaders have grown up with the idea of the United States as the foundational nation, the foundation stone in a lot of these international structures. And so if that foundation stone is just to be removed or is to remove itself, I don't think we've really figured out how those structures exactly would look without that level of American involvement.
All right, obviously a story we'll continue to cover. For now, we'll leave it at that. Niall Stanage, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Drew.